Thank you for joining us this afternoon. I'm Sherry Leese. I'm the program leader for the Great Plains Fire Science Exchange, and I'll be moderating the presentation today. Just a quick note about the exchange. We are dedicated to making fire science accessible in the region, and our focus is on grassland systems in the Great Plains. If you're not familiar with the Great Plains, I'd like to encourage you to visit our website, and the address is there on the screen. You can sign up for our online newsletter and communications through the website, or you can also email me at gpfirescience@missouristate.edu. And you can access much of our work on the website or through Facebook, Twitter, and our YouTube recordings. A little bit about the webinar environment here. If you haven't participated on an Adobe Connect webinar before, all the participants are muted, but you can communicate with us in a couple of ways. You can write your questions and comments in the chat box that I think should be along your left-hand side of the screen. You also have an opportunity to interact with us. There's a little icon of a person raising their hand, and there's a drop down there with some indicators such as agree, disagree, speak louder or softer, and so on. So you can also let us know if we need to make some adjustments using those. And so I am recording this webinar, and we'll have it available on our YouTube site after I've had a chance to download and edit it. So you'll be able to share that with others who couldn't make it today. And I just want to let you know a few things that are going on, and then we'll jump right into the webinar. For those of you interested in the Society for Range Management, we have a field trip coming up that's at that annual meeting at the end of this month to the Aransas Wildlife Refuge. We're also sponsoring the Niobrara Valley Preserve Training Exchange Program that's in Nebraska. And we are offering additional support for participants with tribal affiliation to attend that event. There are lots of prescribed fire workshops going on around the region in Kansas, Nebraska, and I think Missouri announced some recently as well. And those of you interested in attending conferences, there's a Fire and Behavior and Fuels conference coming up in April. All right, so today I'm excited to introduce our speaker, Dr. Derek Skasta. Dr. Skasta is an assistant professor and extension specialist at the University of Wyoming. He's focused on plant-herbivore interactions. He has degrees from Texas Tech and Oklahoma State Universities. And in addition to the work that he's sharing with you today on the role of fire and parasites, you might also be interested in looking up some of his work that looks at fecal pats as fuel and tries to relate those into prescribed fire management. So Derek, thank you for being with us today, and without further ado, take it away.
Okay, thank you, Sherry. So thank you everybody for logging in today. As Sherry mentioned, today I'm going to talk about fire and parasites. And I will tell you that I never thought I would study fire and parasites, but it is an exciting area of research because the implications are pretty strong for how we manage animal and human parasites because it builds on ecology and particularly fire ecology. As Sherry mentioned, I have degrees from Texas and Oklahoma. I'm originally from Texas, and that's actually where I was first introduced to livestock parasite management. And so this picture on the right here is an animal that has a bunch of flies. These are actually called horn flies. And I was actually introduced to ways we can use chemicals to manage those parasites. But as I decided to continue to pursue my PhD with a focus on fire ecology, I brought that background and knowledge with me and began to observe some things in the field, and that's really led me into some very interesting research. So I'm excited to share that with you all today. So just to give you some perspective on what I've been thinking about most recently, I want to share with you a paper that recently came out that stimulated some research and reviews of the literature. So at the bottom, you'll see this paper here. Let's see if this works. Yep, this Gottdenker et al. 2014 paper that came out in the Journal of EcoHealth. EcoHealth is a peer-reviewed scientific journal put out by this International Association for Ecology and Health. And in this paper, they reviewed land use changes caused by humans and how that relates to infectious diseases. And interestingly, they didn't recognize fire suppression as a form of land use change. And so that surprised me quite a bit because as we know as fire ecologists, fire regimes have changed. As Stephen Pine has articulated probably better than anyone, changing settlement patterns in the United States led to fire suppression and then broad-scale ecosystem changes. And this anthropogenic or human-induced change with the fire regime isn't unique to North America. It's also occurred in Australia and Africa and other continents as well. And then subsequently, trying to understand how fire and parasites are related isn't intuitive. But when we think about parasites, they spread diseases and they cause substantial economic losses, and also are sensitive to changes in habitat that we can induce with fire. So I'm trying to link these two things up and reconcile this lack of recognition of fire suppression as a change has been a focus of mine. So trying to establish that linkage between fire and parasites is what I'm going to try to do today. I'm really only going to talk about blood-sucking parasites that are invertebrates. I'm not going to talk about other parasites that you may take issue with. So because I'm trained to be somewhat cross-disciplinary, and I've collaborated with a lot of scientists, including livestock entomologists, fire ecologists, conservation biologists. I reviewed the literature and had been doing so for a while. I identified 24 refereed studies, and these included empirical data, but sometimes just anecdotal observations of how fire may have changed parasite dynamics. And then I've also done some of my own research that I'm going to share with you. And I basically published a response to that Gottdenker 2014 paper saying that fire is not been recognized or it's under-recognized, but it's actually a very important disturbance regulating parasites and the spread of diseases by those parasites. So just to give us an overview of some of the basic biological interactions, I'll start with ectoparasites without wings. And arguably the most studied parasite response to fire has been that of ticks. Ticks vector many infectious diseases, and arguably the ranges of some of these diseases are spreading, and the occurrences of these diseases are increasing for a number of different reasons. But fire alone is known to change the microhabitat and reduce all different life stages of ticks. That includes larvae, nymphs, and adults. And these studies come from Texas, Kansas, and go up into the Northeast. And these 4 studies here are all on this species called the Lone Star tick. And you can see its distribution range in this map here. And I'll just note that these all studied the effects of fire alone. So this wasn't the number of parasites on any animals. But fire alone isn't the only way we can alter parasite dynamics, particularly of ticks. There's also been a recent study about how patch burning or patch burn grazing influenced ticks. So this picture here is from Oklahoma State University on the pastures where this research was done. This was not research I was involved with, but some colleagues at Oklahoma State University were. And I'll just point out that you can see kind of this boundary here. And in the foreground, that's a patch that was recently burned. And in the background, that's an area that wasn't burned. And there's no fence. And so these cattle have the opportunity to graze wherever they want to, but subsequently they choose to spend a lot of their time in this recently burned area. And in this study, tick burdens were lower on both adult cows and their calves. And so this study is authored by Polito, and it came out in Rangeland Ecology and Management in 2013. And the difference between this study and these 4 studies that I referenced here is in this study they gathered these animals once a month and actually counted ticks on those animals. And so there were lower densities of ticks, which has great implications for livestock production because ticks are blood obligate parasites, and they can reduce the performance of livestock. As I mentioned before, this interaction and effect of fire on ticks isn't only unique to North America. There have been studies in other continents, particularly Africa, and this information comes from a paper by Winston Trollope from 2011 out of the journal Fire Ecology. And his observations and research in Botswana, Tanzania, and Zambia. And in those countries, controlled burning by indigenous people, so nomadic and communal pastoralists, caused reductions in ticks. And the reason is it altered the microclimate, changed the habitat to a drier habitat that was less favorable for those ticks. And you can see here in this image from that paper, the tick density could be quite high when they had suppressed fire. And this was particularly important for diseases spread by ticks, including babiosis, which is a blood disease. And so when we think about the implications of indigenous people applying fire on the ground, um, it doesn't just apply to ticks. There's some other studies that have shown reductions of parasites that are problematic to people. And that includes chiggers in South Carolina in this 1971 study. Fleas in East Africa. This was a study that only had anecdotal observations. It didn't have empirical data that they actually measured. And then finally, this 1984 paper from Kansas indicated that lice, mites, and other microarthropods were reduced with fire. And really what this indicates to me is that there's this linkage between fire, parasites, and human health. And so it's often difficult to put those together. For fire, we can think about reducing the risk of the loss of property, the loss of life, but there's this ecological and proactive potential to reduce parasites and the subsequent diseases they transmit. And so this picture again from Winston Trollope's paper really links how we can potentially manage those things in these third world and developing countries where we have pastoralists who have a very tight association with animals and the land, whereas they spend a lot of time potentially exposed to those parasites. So when we come back to the United States, I think there are some potential situations where we could consider how fire might be strategically applied to deal with some problems. In particular, cattle fever ticks are a problem along the U.S.-Mexico border. So this map here comes from the Texas Animal Health Commission, TAHC website, and this is the most current infestation map from November 30th of last year. And you'll note the counties from Valverde County all the way down here to Brownsville, Cameron County, are noted as quarantine counties in the quarantine zone. And then there's a red line here, and this is the quarantine line. It runs very close to the Rio Grande River. And this is the area where cattle fever ticks are really a major concern. But we know that there's great potential to alter tick populations and tick habitat with fire, and I would be curious to see how this might be more strategically applied. Shifting gears just a little bit, I now will talk about ectoparasites that have wings, and this has been an area that I've been working on quite a bit. In particular, flies that are problematic parasites for cattle. Flies are known to be the most economically damaging parasite for livestock, and in the United States alone, caused losses exceeding $1 billion. But there's biological evidence that suggests fire could alter the reproductive habitat and the biological cycles of those flies, and this has been an area that I've been working on for a number of years. So I'm going to share some of that data with you right now. So these 3 studies referenced here at the bottom are really the 3 core papers that we've put out with my research group that have assessed these flies on cattle, and these have all come from a patch burning style of management. And so this picture here, you can see one of our study sites that was in Oklahoma, and you can see these patch boundaries. You can notice that cattle are grazing in the central patch, which was most recently burned. The patch in the foreground had not been burned for 2 years, and the patch in the background had been burned the year prior. But what's interesting when we think about fire and parasites, we have to think about interactions and processes that occur at the landscape level, like we see in this picture, but also things that occur at the individual animal level. So here we can see this cow. She has a lot of different fly parasites on her, and as we zoom in to an even smaller spatial scale, this is when we can begin to actually observe and count or quantify those flies. So these are horn flies. They have a very unique orientation where they have their head down and their wings up, and so we can use digital images to count flies very systematically over time. So in 2011, we did a pilot study relative to our patch burn grazing treatments, and we did it in 2 locations. That's on the bottom axis. That included Iowa and Oklahoma. The Oklahoma experiment was located about 15 miles west of Stillwater, and the Iowa location was located about 10 miles within the Iowa-Missouri border. On the left axis, you have average horn flies per cow. And so you'll notice that these bars that are white are the patch burn grazing treatments, and they were always lower than the gray bars, which was where we had no fire at all. And this was a consistent response across these 2 locations. And we can consider what the economic threshold is. So this red line is the economic threshold when an entomologist would say, now we can start to justify the cost of treating these animals. So patch burn grazing was always right around the threshold, whereas not using fire, it was almost always 2 times higher than the economic threshold. So this pilot study was really quite informative, and we decided to continue this work and expand it for 2 additional years. And so this is data from our follow-up study from 2012 and 2013. And this paper was published in Rangeland Ecology and Management in 2015. So I'm going to show you 2 figures. They're oriented the same. On the left will be the Iowa data. On the right will be the Oklahoma data. And on the bottom axis, we'll have bars that represent our treatments in years. So for example, here we have the patch burn grazing bars in 2012 and 2013. And then here we have what we call graze and burn or traditional treatments in 2012, where we burned the entire pasture. And then in 2013, where there was no fire. So the dashed bar, there was no fire at all. So we also evaluated if it was just a treatment effect. So here, was it patch burning versus traditional management, or was it the application of fire that mattered more than how fire was applied? So for horn flies, both treatment and how fire was applied mattered. So patch burning was always lower than traditional management, and fire always mattered. So essentially, it didn't matter if you burned a patch or you burned an entire pasture, there was a reduction in horn flies. In Oklahoma, however, during these 2 years, there were no significant effects. And one of the things that occurred, as many of you probably remember very well, was 2012 was a very dry year. And arguably that year effect was really driving hornfly populations. It also limited our ability to burn with really effective uniform fires. So in Oklahoma, there was not a reduction in hornflies with patch burning. In this follow-up study, we added some additional parasite species. One of those is called face flies. See the scientific name, Musca autumnalis. Face flies congregate around the eyes of cattle, and they can spread certain diseases such as pink eye. So the orientation is the same here. On the left, this will be Iowa. There we go. And then on the right, it'll be Oklahoma. And you'll notice the scale for face flies is much lower than it was for horn flies, and the economic threshold for face flies is about 5 flies per cow. So it doesn't take very many face flies to start causing damage or economic losses. So treatment was a significant effect. There were much lower face flies populations with patch burning, but interestingly, the presence or absence of fire didn't matter. It was how fire was applied. In other words, patchy fires caused a reduction. Burning entire pastures did not cause a reduction. So that response of animals to the burn patch also had an influence. Similar to our response in Oklahoma for horn flies, there were no effects for face flies in Oklahoma. Again, we had drought, but Oklahoma is also at the very southern extent of the range for face flies, which may have had something to do with those low numbers. So as I mentioned, face flies spread some diseases, one of which is called pink eye or infectious bovine keratoconjunctivitis. So this is a calf from one of our pastures in 2012 that hadn't been burned. And you'll notice when you look at the eye, the discoloration of the cornea or the turning white of the cornea. And at least anecdotally or observationally, we did have greater problems of pink eye where we hadn't had any fire. So the implications of how we might reduce diseases are pretty strong. There's another disease, infectious bovine rhinotracheitis or IBR, which is a respiratory disease, which has also been associated with face flies. So this is a paper that hasn't been published yet, so it's fixing to go to a journal for peer review. So I'm excited to share this kind of latest analysis with you. So in 2012 we assessed horn flies and face flies. We also looked at 2 other fly parasites, some of which you may be familiar with. One of them is horse flies or tabanids, and then another is stable flies. And we used ordination to look at the composition, fly parasite composition of these herds. And so I'll direct your attention here because I know this is kind of messy. Within this red box, you'll see these 3 triangles. The dashed lines represent pastures and herds that had been patch burned. The solid line represents the pastures in 2012 that were burned completely. So the entire pasture was burned. And you'll notice we have these envelopes that there's some overlap. So arguably, they really weren't too dissimilar. There was some similarity. But compared to the pastures that we had not burned, they were quite different. There was no overlap. So this principal components analysis suggests that when we consider all of these potential fly parasites, fire changes that composition on cattle. So we took this data, and this was an unconstrained ordination, and we decided to constrain it to some variables that we knew something about. And so I'll explain this because this one's even busier than the last one. So the first thing I'll point out is we have these treatments. This is the conventional treatment or traditional management, and this is heterogeneity management. So this would be patch burning. These dashed lines represent the fly species. These are face flies, these are horn flies, and then these right here would be horse flies and stable flies. And finally, we have some vegetation variables that we measured. So we measured woody plant cover, vegetation structure, and litter cover. So now I'm going to direct your attention to a few points in this figure. So the first point is that face flies had a very tight association with woody plant cover. So the closer these arrows are to one another, the more correlated they are, so to speak. Furthermore, face flies were very tightly coupled with conventional management. Okay, so where we were just burning every 3 years, trying to burn the entire pasture, we had an increase in woody plant cover and we had greater face fly populations on cows. Secondly, we can look at horn flies. Horn flies were very tightly associated with vegetation structure. So these arrows are very close to one another, and they're also somewhat close to this conventional style of management. Lastly, we can look at the orientation of horseflies and stable flies. They were closely associated with litter cover, and they weren't really correlated with either style of management. So then when we look at the directions that these two different types of treatment are going, we can notice that heterogeneity management is really going away from some of these other increases of vegetation variables. So it's lower woody plant cover and lower vegetation structure. So that these parasites respond to habitat the way we think other organisms might respond to habitat. But we can potentially alter those with our applications of fire. And
Eric,
interestingly, yep,
can you mention what measure you used for vegetation structure?
I can. So we used visual obstruction with the Robel
Okay,
pole.
thanks. Got it.
That's a great question, and I meant to say that, Sherry. So that's the same way that bird ecologists measure vegetation structure as well. Um, the point I was going to make is that horn flies in this green polygon are actually not native to the United States. So this also suggests that they may not be adapted to this fire grazing disturbance. So we can take that information and we can simplify it a little bit using linear regression. So here we have vegetation structure along the bottom axis and then herd fly composition scores. And as vegetation structure increases, the composition of all these different fly parasites increase. And so that'd be that entire animal. But we can also look more specifically at these and we can quantify the increases with increases in habitat. So this is horn flies, and so these are typically on the back and sides of animals. And we can look at our equation explaining this relationship. So for every 1 decimeter increase in vegetation structure, we have an increase of about 20 horn flies on average. So that's something we can use to start to relate back to economic thresholds. And then we can do this for face flies as well. But we can relate it back to the species specific response. And so that is for woody plant cover. For every 1% increase in woody plant cover, we get a 1 to 2 increase in face flies. And you'll remember that the economic threshold is only 5. So everything above about 2% woody plant cover is over the economic threshold in our study. So that's great implications for how we need to manage those flies and the potential diseases such as pink eye that they spread. So one other question that I've had in my research program is, can we separate the influence of weather and climate from fire with respect to parasite dynamics? And so we did some information theoretic modeling for hornfly and facefly seasonal patterns. We had a bunch of different measures of temperature, precipitation, and then we had our patch burn grazing management. And essentially, we wanted to calculate these importance values relative to weather. And our importance values were related to management. So how much more important was management than our top weather models? So this is a really busy table. Tables are never good for presentations, so I broke a rule there. But I just wanted to illustrate the different ways we can think about weather and its influence on parasites. So for temperature, we could think, was it the recent low temperatures? Was it the high temperature at the time of observation? Was it the recent high a couple of weeks before that have an influence on emergence of eggs of these parasites? And similarly with precipitation. So in this modeling, we looked at temperature variables alone, and then we looked at precipitation variables alone, and then we built these final models and we added in management. And so what we found is that management coupled with weather was the best model. I know that's messed up, I apologize. But here's the take-home point here. The importance values of models with and without management was 0.89. So that could go from 0 to 1. So 0.89 is quite high for models that include heterogeneity management as a parameter. So what that means is face flies in this example are sensitive to heterogeneity management, which the bar graphs I showed you already indicate that, with fire, or in other words, that application of fire might be as important or more important than weather variables alone. So heterogeneity that is structured with fire and grazing interactive processes may regulate parasite dynamics as much or more than weather. And there was a similar result that we found for horn flies with these importance values. Okay, so I'm going to shift away from my own research just a little bit. I'm going to talk about a few other parasites that are of major concern, and that includes mosquitoes. So fire may alter mosquito biology. Um, a paper came out in 2013 by O'Brien and Reiskind, and this was also from Oklahoma State University. And they found there was a relationship between cedar trees, particularly eastern red cedar, and this mosquito that's called Culex tarsalis. The thing about Culex tarsalis, and it's kind of a notorious species of parasite because it vectors two problematic diseases. And these include West Nile virus and Western equine encephalitis. So as juniper density increases, Culex tarsalis populations increase as well. So when we suppress fire in the plains, we get this increase in fire-sensitive conifers. We may potentially be getting an increase of mosquitoes that are of concern in terms of humans and animals. There were similar results in Kenya, but this was burning floodwater vegetation. So Oklahoma was more upland types of ecological sites. In Kenya, this is more riparian. And what they found was that it not only reduced mosquito populations, but it potentially can reduce global diseases, epizootic or epidemic diseases such as anthrax and Rift Valley fever. So one of the things that makes me consider is, and this is a little bit tongue-in-cheek here, so we have the DDT truck, right? I'm not sure what year this was, not recent, and we have these young people playing in the fog. What if we had an alternative to fogging with insecticides, and that was strategic applications of fire, potentially in waterways or riparian areas that we know that mosquitoes and their eggs and larvae exist. So this is a bit of a change in a paradigm, a change in our way of thinking and how we might manage these mosquitoes. And also in that wildland urban interface where we're on these margins of areas. So there are also parasites that live inside of organisms, and these are internal parasites or endoparasites. And arguably less is known about the effect of fire on these internal parasites. There are some anecdotal observations that fire can cause some reductions. And this includes a report from Australia where the terrestrial stages of gastrointestinal parasites of sheep were reduced. And then Haemonkis, which is a gastrointestinal nematode, could be reduced in Indiana, and Haemonkis is really problematic in sheep and goats. But none of these are actually experiments. These are just anecdotal observations or assumptions. But when we think about the biological cycle of these internal parasites, I think there's evidence that does suggest this could be true. So internal parasites are often deposited in the feces of animals, and these eggs hatch and develop in the soil and the manure, and oftentimes that soil-manure interface. And then ultimately, they have this terrestrial stage where they use the vegetation. And I think that if we potentially burned and altered this stage right here, there's potential to reduce those populations and then potentially attract those animals to that essentially parasite-free area. So understanding the biology and the terrestrial stages, I think, could influence how we use fire to accomplish some of those internal parasite problems. Now, there are a few studies that are very interesting about how fire has reduced endoparasites. The first is a study of native sheep in British Columbia, where lungworms in sheep that had access to burned areas had a tenfold lower density of lungworms. That's in Seep and Bunnell, 1985. There's also been evidence that fire can alter the intermediate host ecology of brainworms, meningeal brainworms. And I want you all to just make note of this scientific name here. So Paralaphostrongylus tenuis, because I'm going to mention that at the end when I talk about moose and some moose parasite problems that we're dealing with. But fire altered the microhabitat of the snail and slug hosts that carry that brainworm, which is a problem in elk and deer. And arguably, suppressing fire creates microhabitat that is wet and moist with a lot of litter where those gastropod hosts can thrive. Lastly, there's a paper or a number of papers from Montana by Blake Hosick where internal nematode parasites of amphibians can be reduced with fire. And he has some studies in wildfires. So from a conservation standpoint, there are some amphibians that are of high concern. So in conclusion, I think there's a number of papers that document the fire effects on parasites. Most of those studies were experimental, and most of them only documented the reduction of parasites. I think we need to learn more about how the actual disease pathogen changes. Some of these reductions are direct, such as mosquitoes in Kenya. Some of them are indirect, such as the tick study in Oklahoma, where it was the animal foraging decision that really also had an impact, or potentially both. And I think some of the fly research has indicated that. And a reduction of parasites with fire may be a way to reduce exposure of humans and animals to these parasites and the diseases that they transmit. So this is a paper that we just put out with some colleagues from Montana, North Dakota, Oklahoma, Utah State, and then myself here at Wyoming, assessing how patch burn grazing can be an alternative for livestock management. And I'll just point out some of the studies I've mentioned are in this map, that this interaction between fire and grazing really spans precipitation and temperature gradients. So there are studies from Florida all the way up to British Columbia that show this interaction. So I want to talk about some of the mechanisms in just a bit of detail, and then I want to give you some implications for some future research that I think needs to be done. So the first direct mechanism is the immediate attraction to the burned area. Animals are very curious about fire. I've seen this also in wildlife, and they identify spatially where that area is by some cues, probably verbal, but also by smell, verbal, visual. Nobody's telling them where to go. Visual cues. They see the smoke. They see the fire. but they can also smell it, and oftentimes they very rapidly go to the burned area. But a second direct mechanism is this combustion of fecal resources, and this is what Sherry mentioned at the beginning. So this is a picture immediately following the passage of the flame front through this area, and you can see all of these fecal pats are actively smoldering. So there's active combustion going on, and we measured the time that it continued after the fire passed, and it continued for several hours in some areas. So we wanted to understand what was driving this fecal combustion with fire. This is busy, and I apologize again. So we looked at 10 fires. We looked at the condition of the fecal pats. We also looked at fuel load and then time lag fuel moisture. And then we looked at weather, including relative humidity, temperature, and wind. And we found that the condition of the fecal resource, the 10-hour dry fuel moisture class, and fuel load really had the greatest effect on how these fecal resources burned up. So you'll notice in these two figures, we just have separated some of this out. On the left, we have the 10-hour time lag fuel moisture class. And on the right, we have fuel load. That's megagrams, or you could interpret that as 1,000 kilograms. And then we have percent combustion. So as 10-hour time lag fuel moisture goes down, combustion of those fecal resources goes up. And as fuel load increases, combustion increases, but really only for the older, drier fecal resources. So timing when we burn relative to when grazing animals are in an area could be a strategic way to alter those fecal resources. And this is important for both internal parasites that rely on those for reproduction, but also fly parasites like cornflies that lay their eggs in those fecal pats. So I think that's one of the direct mechanisms that reduce those parasite loads. One of the indirect mechanisms that I think alters these parasite dynamics is this repeated attraction and foraging in the burned area. So Follendorf reported up to 75% of grazing time is in the burn patch. Arguably, as you move into lower precip zones, that amount of time probably decreases. Augustine and Derner have a paper from the shortgrass steppe of eastern Colorado that reported a number in the 30 percentile range. But nonetheless, that repeated foraging also alters the visual obstruction or the vegetation structure and probably the microclimate of that habitat. So some of the research that I'm working on in Wyoming is to understand how wildlife are attracted to patchy fires. So these were patchy fires that were burned in shrub communities about 100 miles west of Laramie. We have paired game cameras paired up on burned, unburned areas, and we're really interested in mule deer, pronghorn, and elk. Our 2015 data, which is still a bit preliminary, does show that the burn patches have more total wildlife activity than the unburned patches. A lot of that is driven by elk, elk activity. We're going to continue this in 2016 and hope to provide that in some type of a peer-reviewed format. But understanding how wildlife are attracted, as we know cattle are to those unburned areas. As I mentioned, Augustine and Derner do have a paper that looked at pronghorn responses to their patchy burns, and there was a very strong attraction as well. So here's kind of how I'm going to wrap it up. I just want to give some potential ideas for future work on fire and parasites, ideas that I think I would love to work on or I would love to see other people working on. The first is parasites of moose. And really there's two that are really of high concern. And the first is this meningeal brainworm. So you'll notice that that is the same brainworm that I mentioned that they were reducing in the southeastern United States. And arguably, we could similarly reduce the habitat that's suitable for those gastropod hosts, those intermediate hosts. There's also a tick that's quite problematic in moose, winter tick, Dermacentor albipictus. Um, it spends the majority of its life, matter of fact, all of its life on a single host, but I don't think anyone has ever done work on how fire alters winter tick habitat or populations. And this is a major issue. So this picture is from National Geographic. It's a major concern. Um, Anywhere there are moose populations, from the northern woods of Minnesota to here outside of Laramie, where we have typically had some fairly strong moose populations. The second area that I think could be investigated is this internal parasite effects of livestock and wildlife. Because we know there are these um, fecal resource dependencies of these species, the evidence I've seen suggests that we could probably reduce those, although it hasn't really been quantified in cattle parasites. And I think that's something that could easily be done. It just hasn't been done yet. So this is a model. This was just adapted from the Follendorf 2008 model of how fire and grazing probabilities could um, potentially influence the probability of parasites and fecal concentrations of parasites. So as we burn, grazing time goes up. Fecal resources are concentrated. When we burn a new area, there had been no grazing, and so there may not be as high of parasite loads. So you essentially have patches that are very low in parasite loads. A third area that I think we could work on, and it's a reason I think fire ecology for parasites is important, is how we can manage chemical resistance. So currently there's no cultural methods for parasites that can be applied across large landscapes. I would argue that that's actually not true, that fire is the cultural method that could be applied across these large landscapes. And this is important for chemical resistance for two reasons. One, insecticides can have negative off-target effects on other invertebrates. Oftentimes, we may not know what those negative off-target effects are. But secondly, and probably most importantly for parasites, particularly of livestock, chemical resistance can develop very rapidly. So those parasite organisms can become resistant to active ingredients, oftentimes within 1 to 2 years. And so managing that is very important, because the application of those chemicals can arguably lose its effect over time due to chemical resistance. And then fourth is how we can work on international issues that are really confounded by livestock-wildlife interactions. So I talked about this earlier, cattle fever ticks. So in this picture, which is near Laredo, Texas, you can see the primary method of managing cattle fever ticks, and that's dipping cattle. So this is very intensive in terms of time, money, human resources, and arguably may not have any effect on the wildlife hosts and their cattle fever tick loads. So cattle fever ticks are known to infest white-tailed deer, nilgai, antelope, red deer, and black buck antelope, and probably other wildlife species. So my argument is that fire is a more economical and probably more effective if it indeed would reduce cattle fever tick populations. I don't know if it would, but that's an area that I think deserves some more investigation. So to tie it all up, I think fire ecology, parasitology, and then animal production and the conservation of certain wildlife species, I think they need to be more integrated as a priority area for future research. As I mentioned at the beginning, this isn't an area that I ever anticipated working in, but it's one that has been of interest. So I mentioned this paper here by our livestock entomologist, Justin Talley. He's located down at Oklahoma State. And this was an invited paper by the Entomological Society of America. So it was titled Cross-Disciplinary Dialogue Between Animal Scientists, Rangeland Ecologists, and Veterinary Entomologists leads to novel control practices of external parasites in beef systems. So there's great interest in this collaborative interdisciplinary approach. And then lastly, I think there's implications for both humans and animals. I have seen some cases uh, with people that I think had contracted some animal diseases that were known to be problematic in both. So I think there's implications for some of the most susceptible people as well. So with that, I really appreciate everybody's attendance today. I hope it's useful, and I would be happy to try to answer any questions.
Thank you, Derek. Yeah, if you have questions, please type them in the chat box and we'll answer them. Um, I thought it was really interesting. I hadn't really thought about the relationship of mosquitoes and junipers. And so, do we know, is it specific to eastern red cedar, or do other species of junipers in the region harbor mosquitoes in the same way?
I don't know that, and that's a good question because I did just put up the genus, right? I just put up juniperous species. That's specific to eastern red cedars because it was done, the research was outside of Stillwater. So I don't know. That's a question. You know, as we have these state changes in terms of vegetation across the landscape, like cedar encroachment, cedar woodlands, um, that's an area that probably deserves some additional questions. So does the same thing occur with ash juniper in the west, uh, western juniper? I'm not sure.
Yeah, that one really caught my attention. So what's been the response as you kind of put this idea out there of fire being uh, a control mechanism for parasites and potentially reducing or replacing the need for chemical solutions?
You know, it's been variable. So I think some ranchers have expressed interest in it, particularly in the central Great Plains. Some that were already burning, and I think it was a benefit they may not have even realized. So it may be something that was just happening because they were already using fire. So they were happy to know that there was this other benefit. I think some people have raised their eyebrow initially as you try to argue that fire and parasites are linked, and there's this other implication beyond just conservation of, say, certain wildlife species. And I think it's really important because the more we can learn about all of the ecological implications of fire regimes and integrating or restoring fire, um, this really adds another layer and it links it back to health, be it animal health or human health. So um, the interest has been strong. Once you present some of this data, I think the light bulb turns on, as it has turned on for me, about the ecological interactions.
Yeah, I wonder if there's some way to trace back historically, like the incidences of a particular vector or disease that's caused by it, and maybe some guesses as to the amount of fire at those points in time. I know there's probably going to be way too much speculation in putting those numbers together, but that'd be
Well,
pretty neat to see.
that would be really, really cool to see. You know, one of the problems with quantifying these external parasites, it's very time consuming. So it's very labor intensive. And I don't know that the data is there, to be honest. Um, Perhaps there might be reports where a certain parasite hadn't been a problem in an area and all of a sudden is. I do think that if some of the forecasts for warming hold, um, that we may see greater incidences in some areas we hadn't seen. So, for example, in Wyoming, we have a lot of high elevation range where cattle are grazed and sheep for the summer. Um, and there's some old rules of thumb about where parasites do or don't occur. And I think those elevations may be moving up. And that's been shown in some locations, in particular Hawaii, that has some high elevations. So, where we think we had some of these problems could be changing as our climate um, is increasingly variable, and some of those things. So yeah.
Cool. Good stuff. So it doesn't look like anybody has typed anything in. So Derek, would you mind putting your email address there in the chat box in case somebody thinks of something that they'd like to pick your brain about later on?
You
Great,
bet.
thanks.
And
And so
one other
again,
thing,
oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, let's see if I can get there right quick, is if you are interested in the research, here's the 3 papers. If you would want to see those in detail, I would be happy to send those to you. Um, we have the additional paper we hope to put out, and I'm continuing to do some parasite work here in Wyoming. So if anybody's really interested in the science, I'd be happy to chat more.
So maybe one thing we could do, if any of those are open access documents, if you could send them to me, and if not, just send me the citations, and I'll get those actually linked in with the announcement and the recording of the webinar so people can trace it back.
Okay, I'll check on that.
Great. Okay. Oh, well, Patrick, I'm sorry that you had a bad connection. Hopefully when you get the recording, you'll be able to listen to it a little bit